In 1858, deep in the hills of rural Kentucky, the St. Benedict Monastery stood as a beacon of faith, but beneath its sacred walls lay a darkness that would haunt generations. When a traveling magistrate arrived to investigate reports of irregularities, he found 15 monks living in isolation with 40 enslaved people who had vanished from all official records. What followed was a discovery so disturbing that church authorities ordered all documents sealed for 150 years. In 2008, when those archives finally opened, historians uncovered evidence of rituals, unmarked graves, and a theological justification for cruelty that defied comprehension. This is the story of what happened inside those monastery walls, a truth buried in consecrated ground. Chapter 1. The Arrival. There are events in history so disturbing that institutions deliberately erase them from memory. In the spring of 1858, in a remote monastery perched on the limestone cliffs of eastern Kentucky, something happened that church officials would spend the next century and a half trying to forget. Magistrate Thomas Brennan arrived at St. Benedict Monastery on a routine inspection, expecting nothing more than accounting irregularities. What he discovered instead would haunt him until his death 40 years later, and the documents he sealed in a courthouse vault would remain hidden until 2008. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The monastery sat 3 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense forest. Local residents avoided the area, and when pressed, they spoke in whispers of strange chants echoing through the valley at night, and the smell of smoke that hung in the air on moonless evenings. The monks of St. Benedict had arrived from Bavaria in 1842, purchasing 800 acres and 40 enslaved people from a bankrupt plantation. They promised to bring enlightenment and Christian education to those they now owned. Instead, they created something far darker. Magistrate Brennan's journal, discovered in a trunk in his great-granddaughter's attic in 1987, described his arrival in precise, disturbing detail. The monastery gates stood open, but no one came to greet him. He rode his horse through an overgrown courtyard where weeds pushed through cracked stone. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, nothing but the distant sound of water dripping somewhere inside the stone buildings. He dismounted and called out. No answer came. The main chapel door hung ajar. Inside, Brennan found all 15 monks kneeling in prayer, their backs to the entrance, their voices raised in a Latin chant he didn't recognize. He waited for them to acknowledge his presence. They did not. For 20 minutes, he stood in that doorway while they prayed, and slowly he became aware of something else, a smell sweet and sickly, like rotting flowers mixed with something metallic. It came from beneath the floor. When the chanting finally stopped, the abbot rose and turned to face him. Father Wilhelm was a gaunt man with eyes that seemed to look through rather than at Brennan. He spoke with a thick German accent, his words carefully measured. "Magistrate, we have been expecting you, but you are too late. The work is complete." Brennan demanded to know what work he meant and where the enslaved people were. The abbot smiled, a thin, joyless expression. "They have been elevated," he said. "Come, I will show you what we have achieved." The abbot led Brennan through the monastery, past dormitories where narrow cots lined the walls, past a kitchen where pots still sat on cold stoves, past a library filled with ancient theological texts bound in cracked leather. They descended stone stairs into a basement that opened into natural limestone caves beneath the monastery. The smell grew stronger with each step. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows on walls covered with Latin inscriptions and strange symbols that Brennan didn't recognize as Christian. And then he saw them. 40 bodies lay arranged in a perfect circle in the largest cave chamber. Men, women, and children dressed in white linen shrouds, their hands folded across their chests. Their skin had the waxy pallor of death, but there was no sign of violence, no blood, no wounds. They looked as if they had simply lain down to sleep and never woken. Around them, carved into the limestone floor, was a circle of text in Latin. Brennan, who had studied classics at university, translated the words slowly. Through sacrifice comes transcendence. Through suffering comes salvation. Through death comes eternal service. The abbot watched Brennan's face as the magistrate struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. "They volunteered," Father Wilhelm said quietly. "Every single one. We showed them the path to true salvation, and they embraced it willingly." Brennan's hand moved to the pistol at his belt. He demanded to know what had happened, what the monks had done. The abbot's smile never wavered. "We performed the Great Elevation, a ritual lost to time, recovered from texts the Church tried to destroy. We freed them from the bondage of flesh so they could serve in a higher realm. They are with God now, Magistrate. Can you not feel their presence?" Brennan fled the monastery that day and rode directly to the nearest military garrison. By the time soldiers arrived 3 days later, the monastery was empty. The 15 monks had vanished without a trace. The 40 bodies remained in the cave, arranged in their perfect circle, preserved by the cool limestone air. And in the abbot's quarters, soldiers found something that would ensure this case would be buried for generations. A letter bearing the seal of a cardinal in Rome, dated 6 months earlier, explicitly authorizing the theological experiment at St. Benedict Monastery. The army sealed the monastery. Church officials arrived within a week and confiscated all documents. Brennan was ordered to sign a sworn statement that he would never speak of what he had witnessed, under threat of charges of sedition and blasphemy. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves on monastery grounds. Official records stated only that a fever had claimed the enslaved population and that the monks had returned to Europe. The local community, already fearful of the place, accepted the explanation and tried to forget. But secrets buried in consecrated ground have a way of resurfacing. Chapter 2. The Silence. For 40 years, Thomas Brennan kept his oath of silence. He never spoke of what he had seen in the limestone caves beneath St. Benedict Monastery, even to his wife, even to his children, but he couldn't forget. His journal entries from 1858 onward revealed a man tormented by questions that had no answers. How had 40 people died without struggle? Why had church officials authorized what appeared to be mass murder disguised as religious ritual? And most disturbing, what had the monks meant when they said the enslaved people had volunteered for this so-called elevation? The monastery itself stood abandoned for decades. Local farmers avoided the property, claiming their animals refused to graze near the boundary stones. Children dared each other to approach the gates, but rarely got closer than the road. Stories circulated of lights seen in the chapel windows on certain nights, of chanting heard echoing through the valley, of figures in robes walking the grounds when the moon was dark. The county tried several times to sell the property, but no buyers emerged. It sat, isolated and forgotten, slowly surrendering to the encroaching forest. What the public didn't know was that the property remained under direct Vatican control. Documents discovered in 2008 revealed that the Holy See had purchased the monastery and its grounds from the county in 1862 for an extraordinary sum, then placed the entire archive under a 150-year seal. Any church official who accessed the St. Benedict files was required to sign the same oath of silence that had bound Magistrate Brennan. The church was determined that whatever had happened in those Kentucky hills would remain buried until everyone who might remember was long dead. But the descendants of the 40 enslaved people remembered. Though official records claimed they had died of fever, the families who had been separated from those taken to St. Benedict knew better. Oral histories passed down through generations told of letters that suddenly stopped arriving, of relatives who went to the monastery and were turned away at gunpoint, of questions met with threats from local authorities. The black community in the surrounding counties understood that something terrible had happened, even if they didn't know the specifics. One family in particular never stopped searching for answers. The Moreau family, descended from a woman named Celeste, whose 3 children had been among the 40, kept records of their own. In a cedar chest that passed from grandmother to granddaughter, they preserved every scrap of information they could gather: newspaper clippings that mentioned the monastery, sketches of the property drawn from memory, testimonies from people who had seen their relatives being taken there. They documented the moment when letters stopped coming and the date when they were told their family members had died. They noted every inconsistency in the official story. In 1893, Celeste's grandson, a freedman named Marcus Moreau, who had learned to read and write, attempted to visit the monastery grounds. He was arrested for trespassing before he reached the gates and spent 3 days in jail. The sheriff told him that if he ever returned, he would be charged with attempted arson, a hanging offense. Marcus documented this encounter in a letter to his mother, writing, "They guard that place like it holds the devil himself. Whatever happened to grandmother's children, they don't want anyone to know." The turn of the century brought industrialization and progress, but St. Benedict Monastery remained frozen in time. In 1912, a real estate developer tried to purchase the property, planning to convert it into a sanitarium. Vatican lawyers blocked the sale with a court order so swift and absolute that the developer never tried again. In 1934, during the Great Depression, the county attempted to seize the property for unpaid taxes. Again, the Vatican intervened, paying decades of back taxes in a single payment and reinforcing the property's protected status. By the 1950s, most people had forgotten the monastery existed. It didn't appear on tourist maps or in local histories. The road leading to it had deteriorated so badly that it was nearly impassable. But the Moreau family hadn't forgotten. Every generation produced at least one member who continued the search for truth. They filed requests for documents that didn't exist, searched archives that had been purged, interviewed elderly residents who remembered only whispers and rumors. They hit wall after wall of silence. Then, in 1978, something unexpected happened. A young priest named Father Michael Donovan was assigned to the diocesan archives in Louisville. While cataloguing century-old correspondence, he found a folder marked St. Benedict Monastery, Restricted Access. Inside was Magistrate Brennan's original report, the one that should have been destroyed or sealed in Rome. Donovan read it in growing horror. That night, he made copies and hid them in his personal belongings. He knew the church would never voluntarily release this information, but he also knew it deserved to see light. Father Donovan spent the next 30 years quietly building a case. He researched Bavarian monastic orders, looking for any references to a great elevation ritual. He tracked down descendants of the original monks through European church records. He cross-referenced Brennan's account with medical and forensic knowledge to try to understand how 40 people could die simultaneously with no signs of violence. Most importantly, he began corresponding with the Moreau family, sharing what he had found and working with them to piece together the complete story. In 2005, Father Donovan was diagnosed with terminal cancer. He knew he had limited time to act. He petitioned the Vatican to open the St. Benedict archives early, arguing that enough time had passed and that the descendants of the victims deserved answers. His petition was denied without explanation. Undeterred, he made arrangements to ensure that his research would become public upon his death, regardless of church approval. He died in March 2008, and his executor followed his instructions precisely. Now, invite you to leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. The Moreau family received a package containing everything Father Donovan had discovered. Simultaneously, copies went to 3 major newspapers, 2 university history departments, and a prominent civil rights advocacy organization. The church could no longer contain the story. Within weeks, historians were demanding access to the St. Benedict property. The 150-year seal was technically still in effect for 3 more months, but public pressure was mounting. The Vatican, facing a public relations crisis, agreed to open the archives in June 2008, 3 months ahead of schedule. What they found would prove more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Chapter 3. The archives open. On June 15, 2008, a team of historians, forensic specialists, and Vatican archivists gathered at St. Benedict Monastery for the first time in 150 years. The property had been maintained minimally, enough to prevent complete collapse, but not enough to disturb anything inside. Vines covered the stone walls. Trees had grown through sections of the roof. The iron gates hung rusted on their hinges, but the seal on the main door remained intact, a wax impression bearing the papal insignia of Pius IX, who had ordered the monastery closed in 1858. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic anthropologist from Georgetown University, led the civilian research team. She had studied the leaked Brennan report and Father Donovan's research for months, preparing for what they might find. Standing before those sealed doors, she told the assembled team, "Whatever we discover here, our obligation is to the truth and to the descendants of those who died. This isn't just history. It's a crime scene that's been preserved for a century and a half." The first shock came when they broke the seal and entered the main chapel. Everything remained exactly as it had been in 1858. Hymnals sat open on pews. Candles stood half-burned on the altar. A monk's robe hung on a hook by the sacristy door. It was as if the occupants had simply vanished mid-ceremony, intending to return at any moment. Dust covered everything in thick layers, but beneath the dust, time had stopped. Dr. Chen's team began documenting every detail with cameras and careful notes. In the abbot's quarters, they found Father Wilhelm's personal library. Hundreds of books lined the walls, many of them rare theological texts from the medieval period. But one shelf held something different. Journals bound in black leather, each one marked with a year from 1842 to 1858. These were the abbot's personal records, written in a mixture of German, Latin, and an unknown script that would take linguists months to fully decipher. The first entries described the monks' arrival in Kentucky and their purchase of the enslaved people with chilling detachment. "We have acquired 40 souls," Father Wilhelm wrote in 1842. 23 adults, 17 children. They are ignorant of true faith, but possess the necessary qualities for the great work. Providence has placed them in our care for a divine purpose. We will prepare them carefully, teach them the sacred mysteries, and when the time is proper, we will perform the elevation that our order has guarded for 8 centuries. The journals revealed that the monks belonged to a splinter sect within the Benedictine order, one that had been officially suppressed by the Church in the 1500s, but had continued in secret. They believed they had recovered an ancient ritual from early Christian mysticism, a ceremony that could supposedly free the soul from physical bondage and allow it to serve God directly in the celestial realm. The ritual required willing participants who had been spiritually prepared through years of intense religious education and physical purification. But as Dr. Chen's team read deeper into the journals, a more sinister picture emerged. The spiritual preparation involved systematic isolation, sleep deprivation, and doses of ergot, a grain fungus that causes hallucinations and religious visions. The monks had gradually convinced the enslaved people that they were chosen for divine elevation, that their suffering in this world would be rewarded with immediate entry into paradise, and that by participating in the ritual, they would free not only themselves, but all their descendants from the curse of bondage. Father Wilhelm's entries from 1857 described the final year of preparation with disturbing precision. He documented how each participant had been given a sacred name and taught to chant specific prayers in Latin. He recorded their visions, induced by ergot and isolation, and interpreted them as signs of divine approval. He noted which individuals showed the most fervent belief and which required additional encouragement. By the spring of 1858, he was confident that all 40 were ready for what he called the culmination of our sacred mission. The most chilling entry came from May 1858, just weeks before Magistrate Brennan's arrival. Tonight, we performed the elevation. All 40 souls lay in the sacred circle as we had instructed them. We administered the divine sacrament, the bread of eternal sleep. They consumed it willingly, eagerly, each one believing they would wake in paradise. Brother Matthias led the chanting while I anointed each forehead with consecrated oil. Within 2 hours, all had entered the eternal rest. Their faces showed peace, not suffering. This proves the ritual's validity. They have been freed from earthly bondage and now serve the Almighty in realms beyond our comprehension. Doctor. Jen stared at those words for a long moment before speaking to her team. The bread of eternal sleep. He's describing a mass poisoning. They ground something into communion wafers, probably a combination of opium and hemlock, based on the symptoms described. These people didn't volunteer for death. They were systematically manipulated, drugged into compliance, and murdered while believing they were performing a sacred act. The team descended into the limestone caves beneath the monastery with heavy hearts. The burial site had been sealed by the army in 1858, but the researchers had permission to conduct a full forensic examination. Using ground-penetrating radar, they located the unmarked graves where the 40 bodies had been hastily interred after the monastery was closed. What they found confirmed Dr. Chen's analysis and added new horrors to the story. The bodies had been buried still wearing their white linen shrouds, arranged as they had been found, in a perfect circle. But forensic analysis revealed something Magistrate Brennan hadn't mentioned in his report, either because he hadn't noticed or because it was too disturbing to record. Each body bore marks of prolonged malnourishment. The bones showed evidence of vitamin deficiencies consistent with years of inadequate diet. Several of the children exhibited signs of rickets. This wasn't recent starvation. This was systematic deprivation lasting years. Even more disturbing, toxicology tests on bone marrow revealed high levels of ergot alkaloids accumulated over time. The monks hadn't just poisoned these people at the end. They had been dosing them with hallucinogens for years, inducing religious visions and psychological dependence. The combination of starvation, isolation, and drug-induced altered states had made them completely vulnerable to manipulation. By the time the elevation ceremony occurred, these 40 people had no capacity for true consent. They had been broken down physically and psychologically until they believed death was salvation. If this story has gripped you so far, leave a like. It helps the story of these 40 souls reach more people. Dr. Chen's final report to the Vatican was unsparing in its conclusions. What occurred at St. Benedict Monastery was not a religious ceremony or a mass suicide. It was systematic psychological torture culminating in mass murder. The monks used their religious authority to commit crimes against people who had no legal protection or ability to escape. The Church's decision to seal these records for 150 years prevented justice and denied descendants the truth about their ancestors' fate. This was not an anomaly or an aberration. It was the logical extreme of an institution that treated enslaved people as property to be used for whatever purpose their owners desired. The Vatican's response was carefully worded. They condemned the actions of the monks, acknowledged the suffering of the victims, and offered prayers for the souls of those who died. But they refused to characterize it as anything beyond a tragic deviation by troubled individuals. They did not address why church officials in Rome had authorized the theological experiment, or why they had worked so hard to bury the evidence. Some questions, it seemed, would remain officially unanswered, but the descendants of the 40 victims finally had names, dates, and evidence. They had proof of what their families had always known, that something terrible had happened at St. Benedict, that the official story was a lie, and that their ancestors had been victims of a crime the Church had tried to erase from history. Chapter 4. The Letters. Among the thousands of documents recovered from St. Benedict Monastery, one collection stood out for its heartbreaking intimacy. Personal letters written by the enslaved people to family members they had been separated from when the monks purchased them in 1842. These letters, never sent, had been confiscated by the monks and preserved in a locked trunk in Father Wilhelm's quarters. They provided a window into the minds of people who would later be portrayed as willing participants in their own deaths. The earliest letters dated from 1843, just months after the 40 arrived at the monastery. They were written by the few who could read and write, often dictated by others who couldn't. The tone was cautiously optimistic. "The monks say they will teach us to read scripture," wrote a man named Samuel to his wife, who had been sold to a plantation in Tennessee. "They pray with us every day and say we are children of God like anyone. Maybe this place will be different. I hope you are well. I hope we meet again in this life or the next." A woman named Ruth wrote to her mother in Virginia. "They gave us our own rooms, just 2 or 3 people each. No chains, no whipping so far. We work in their gardens and tend their animals. Father Wilhelm says our souls are precious and that we've been chosen for special instruction. I don't understand all his words, but he speaks kindly. Tell my sisters I think of them every day." But as months turned to years, the tone of the letters changed. By 1845, the writing became more fragmented, confused, filled with religious imagery that seemed disconnected from reality. "I saw angels in the chapel last night," Samuel wrote in a letter that was never finished. "They told me I would be freed from this earthly body. Father Wilhelm says the visions are signs of grace. My hands shake when I try to write. The bread they give us at evening prayers tastes strange, bitter, but afterwards I see such wonders." Ruth's later letters revealed a similar deterioration. "I cannot remember my mother's face anymore. When I close my eyes, I see only light, burning white light. The brothers say, this is holy fire purifying my soul. I am so tired. We work less now, but they wake us at midnight for prayers that last until dawn. I feel like I'm floating, like my body is not quite real. Is this what heaven feels like?" Dr. Chen recognized the symptoms immediately. The monks had been administering ergot systematically through the communion wafers used in evening prayers. The effects, hallucinations, tremors, feelings of dissociation, obsessive religious thoughts, had been documented in medieval records of ergot poisoning. But the monks weren't accidentally poisoning their captives. They were deliberately inducing these states, then reframing them as religious experiences to convince their victims that they were undergoing mystical transformation. The letters from the children were the hardest to read. A girl named Grace, who had been 11 when she arrived at the monastery, wrote to a brother she had been separated from, "I am 15 now, and soon I will be old enough for the elevation. That's what Father Wilhelm calls it. He says, when we are elevated, we leave our bodies behind and go straight to Jesus. No more suffering, no more work, just peace forever. Some of the older ones have already been elevated. We had a ceremony, and they drank special wine, and then they went to sleep. Father Wilhelm says they are in paradise now. I can't wait for my turn. This letter, dated January 1858, was found in Grace's room. She had never sent it because there was no way to send letters from the monastery. The monks read everything, controlled all communication with the outside world. The 40 had been completely isolated, cut off from any perspective that might contradict what the monks were telling them. They had been turned into a captive congregation, fed a theology of death disguised as salvation, but not everyone had been completely convinced. A man named Joseph left a letter hidden inside a Bible in his room, not addressed to anyone, just a raw expression of doubt and fear. Father Wilhelm says we should desire the elevation, that it is the greatest blessing God can offer us. But I remember my grandmother's stories about plantation owners who claimed selling families apart was God's will. How do I know this is different? When I ask questions, the brothers look at me with disappointment. They make me pray extra hours until I stop asking. I'm afraid. I don't want to die, but everyone else seems so certain, so peaceful. Am I the only one who sees this as wrong? Joseph's letter was dated April 1858, just weeks before the mass death. Dr. Chen's team found his remains among the 40, his skull showing signs of old fractures consistent with blunt force trauma. Father Wilhelm's journal mentioned a man who struggled with doubt and required firm correction to accept divine will. Joseph had questioned what was happening and had been beaten into compliance. Then he had been poisoned along with the others. The descendants of the 40 read these letters with tears. For generations, they had been told that their ancestors died of fever, a tragic but natural event. Now they learned the truth. Their relatives had been systematically isolated, drugged, psychologically manipulated, and murdered by men who claimed to speak for God. Some had believed to the end, others had doubted but been too afraid to resist. None had been given a real choice. Marcus Moreau's great-great-granddaughter, a woman named Dr. Lydia Moreau, who was now a professor of African American history at Howard University, gave an interview to National Public Radio in July 2008. My family kept searching for 150 years because we knew the official story didn't make sense, she said. 40 people don't all die of fever at exactly the same time, but we never imagined this. We thought maybe there had been violence, a rebellion put down. We didn't conceive that there could be religious leaders who would spend 16 years breaking people down psychologically, convincing them that death was liberation, then poisoning them in a ritual they called sacred. The letters also revealed details about life at the monastery that Father Wilhelm's journals had glossed over. The work was constant, tending massive gardens, maintaining the buildings, copying texts in the library. The diet was deliberately sparse, justified as fasting for spiritual purification. The sleep deprivation was framed as vigils to draw closer to God. Every aspect of life was controlled and reframed in religious terms. The enslaved people had simply traded one form of bondage for another, but this bondage came wrapped in promises of heavenly reward. One letter, written by a woman named Esther just days before her death, captured the tragedy with painful clarity. Tomorrow is the elevation ceremony. I am ready. Father Wilhelm says we have been purified and prepared for 16 years, and now we will receive our reward. He says we will wake in paradise, free forever. I believe him. I have to believe him. What else do I have? My children were sold before I came here. My husband is dead. This body is worn out from work and hunger. If the monks are telling the truth, I will finally be free. And if they are lying, well, I will be dead either way. At least this way I die with hope instead of despair. Dr. Chen included Esther's letter in her final report with this commentary. This is what slavery did. It created conditions so unbearable that even death seemed preferable. The monks didn't force these people to drink poison at gunpoint. They didn't need to. They just had to convince exhausted, traumatized, isolated people that death was the only escape from suffering. That is the ultimate crime, not just killing them, but making them complicit in their own deaths. Or, the letters were eventually compiled into a book published by the Moreau family in partnership with several universities. Every penny of profit went to a foundation supporting descendants of enslaved people in Kentucky and surrounding states. The book became required reading in many African American history courses. It forced readers to confront an uncomfortable truth. The evil of slavery wasn't just whips and chains. It was also the systematic destruction of hope, the manipulation of faith, and the perversion of religion into a weapon against the powerless. Chapter 5. The Theological Conspiracy. As researchers dug deeper into the monastery's archives, they uncovered evidence that Father Wilhelm and his monks hadn't been acting alone. The great elevation ritual they performed had been explicitly authorized and possibly even requested by high-ranking officials within the Vatican. Documents dating from 1856 revealed a correspondence between Father Wilhelm and Cardinal Giuseppe Antonelli, the Vatican Secretary of State under Pope Pius IX. In his letters to Cardinal Antonelli, Father Wilhelm described his experiment in spiritual transcendence in careful detail. He explained his theory that enslaved people, having suffered greatly in this life, were ideal candidates for a ritual that promised immediate entry into paradise. He argued that performing the elevation on willing participants would demonstrate the power of true faith and potentially validate ancient texts the Church had long dismissed as heretical. Most disturbingly, he suggested that success could provide theological justification for slavery itself, if the enslaved could achieve instant salvation through such rituals. Then perhaps their earthly bondage served a divine purpose. Cardinal Antonelli's responses, preserved in the Vatican's secret archives, showed cautious interest rather than immediate condemnation. In a letter dated October 1856, he wrote, "Your proposition is bold and touches upon mysteries the Church has long considered too dangerous for exploration. However, these are times of great spiritual confusion. The modernists threaten traditional faith with their emphasis on individual conscience and social reform. A demonstration of genuine transcendence, properly documented and witnessed, could reinforce the authority of eternal truth over temporal concerns. Proceed with your preparations. I will arrange for official observers when you deem the moment appropriate." This was not theological exploration. It was a coordinated plan involving the highest levels of the Catholic hierarchy. The Church wasn't simply turning a blind eye to what was happening at St. Benedict. Officials in Rome were actively encouraging it, seeing the enslaved people as expendable subjects in an experiment designed to validate medieval mysticism and push back against growing abolitionist sentiment within Catholic communities. Dr. James Patterson, a religious historian at Yale Divinity School, analyzed the correspondence and concluded, "The Vatican in the 1850s was deeply threatened by social reform movements that emphasized human dignity and individual rights. Abolitionism directly challenged a system that the Church had tacitly supported for centuries. Some officials saw the St. Benedict experiment as a way to reclaim religious authority by demonstrating that spiritual transcendence was more important than physical freedom. If they could show that enslaved people could achieve instant salvation through church-sanctioned rituals, it would undermine arguments that slavery was inherently evil." The documents also revealed why the Church worked so hard to bury the story after everything went wrong. Magistrate Brennan wasn't supposed to arrive when he did. The official Vatican observer, a Monsignor Petrucci from Rome, was scheduled to arrive in June 1858 to witness the elevation ceremony and provide formal documentation. But local complaints about the monastery prompted the magistrate's surprise visit in May. When Brennan discovered the bodies and reported what he had seen, the church faced a disaster. Instead of a controlled demonstration of spiritual power, they had a crime scene and a witness who couldn't be completely silenced. Cardinal Antonelli's final letter to Father Wilhelm, written days after receiving news of Brennan's discovery, was found in a sealed envelope marked, "Destroy after reading." The monks had never opened it. "You have betrayed our confidence and endangered the church," Antonelli wrote. The ritual was to be performed with proper witnesses and documentation. Instead, you acted prematurely and created evidence of what appears to be mass murder. This scandal must be contained completely. Destroy all records of our correspondence. Disperse your brotherhood. Never speak of this again. I will handle the magistrate and ensure official silence. But the price is that this experiment ends immediately. Your order is dissolved, effective upon receipt of this letter. The 15 monks had followed half of these instructions. They had dispersed, vanishing into obscurity. But they had kept the records, perhaps hoping to one day vindicate themselves, perhaps simply unable to destroy what they believed was proof of divine revelation. Those records now revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Further investigation uncovered that St. Benedict wasn't the only location where such experiments had been discussed. Letters between various church officials mentioned similar spiritual elevation programs being considered in Brazil, Cuba, and Louisiana, anywhere the Catholic Church had significant presence among enslaved populations. The St. Benedict disaster had apparently ended these plans before they could be implemented elsewhere, but the fact that they were seriously considered showed how thoroughly some church leaders had embraced slavery as compatible with Christian theology. The modern Catholic Church's response to these revelations was carefully calibrated. In October 2008, the Vatican issued a statement acknowledging that certain officials in the mid-19th century engaged in correspondence regarding theological matters that, while consistent with some historical traditions, reflected views on human dignity that the Church now recognizes as profoundly wrong and incompatible with the gospel message. They stopped short of calling it a conspiracy to commit murder or acknowledging direct institutional responsibility. Many found this response inadequate. Dr. Lydia Moreau spoke at a packed press conference in Washington, D.C. The Vatican authorized these murders. They weren't passive observers. They actively encouraged Father Wilhelm to proceed. Then, when it became public, they covered it up for 150 years. A carefully worded statement about views we now recognize as wrong doesn't begin to address that moral failure. We need acknowledgement of institutional guilt, formal apologies to descendants, and concrete actions to make amends. Some individual bishops and archbishops went further than the official Vatican position. The Archbishop of Louisville issued a public apology for the Church's complicity in the crimes at St. Benedict Monastery and for the deliberate concealment of truth that denied justice to victims and their families. He established a $5 million fund for education and genealogical research for descendants of enslaved people in Kentucky. But these individual actions highlighted the absence of similar accountability from Rome. The theological dimensions of the case sparked intense debate in Catholic academic circles. Progressive theologians argued that the St. Benedict case demonstrated how badly the Church had strayed from core gospel values in the 19th century. Conservative voices pushed back, claiming the incident was an isolated aberration by fringe figures rather than evidence of systemic moral failure. But the documents were clear. This wasn't fringe theology. It was sanctioned at the highest levels. Professor Angela Browning, a black Catholic theologian at Notre Dame, wrote an influential essay titled "The Bodies Beneath the Chapel Floor." In it, she argued, "For too long, the Church has treated its relationship with slavery as an unfortunate historical accident rather than a theological catastrophe. St. Benedict Monastery shows us the truth. When you build a theology that prioritizes institutional authority over human dignity, when you value eternal souls while discounting temporal bodies, when you see suffering as spiritually beneficial rather than morally outrageous, you create the conditions for atrocity. 40 people died because Catholic officials believed their lives mattered less than a theological experiment. Until we confront that reality completely, we haven't truly reckoned with our history." Nadici, the documents also raised uncomfortable questions about what else might be hidden in sealed church archives. If the St. Benedict records had been kept secret for 150 years, what other crimes and conspiracies remained buried? Historians began calling for systematic review of restricted Vatican archives, particularly those dealing with slavery, colonialism, and indigenous peoples. The Church resisted these calls, citing privacy concerns and the complexity of historical context. The battle over historical truth and institutional accountability continues. Chapter 6. The Science of Death. While historians and theologians debated moral responsibility, forensic scientists worked to understand exactly what had killed the 40 people found in the limestone caves. Dr. Sarah Chen's team conducted extensive analysis of the remains, and their findings revealed a systematic poisoning more sophisticated than anyone had initially understood. The toxicology reports showed multiple substances in bone marrow samples, ergot alkaloids consistent with long-term consumption of contaminated grain, traces of opium, and high concentrations of hemlock alkaloids. Father Wilhelm hadn't simply given his victims a single fatal dose. He had been preparing their bodies for months, with escalating levels of various compounds, gradually building tolerance while inducing psychological dependency on the altered states these drugs produced. This was pharmacological grooming, Dr. Chen explained in a detailed report published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. Father Wilhelm studied medieval texts on herbal medicine and poisons. He understood how to use these substances to break down resistance, induce religious visions, and ultimately cause death in a way that appeared peaceful. The ergot created hallucinations and religious ecstasy. The opium reduced anxiety and created euphoria. By the time he administered the fatal hemlock dose, the victims were physically and psychologically primed to accept it as a sacrament, rather than recognizing it as poison. Analysis of Father Wilhelm's journals revealed the precise recipe he had developed. Starting in 1854, he began adding small amounts of ergot-contaminated rye flour to the communion wafers used in evening prayers. The dosage was calibrated to induce mild hallucinations, enough to create a sense of mystical experience, but not enough to cause the full-blown symptoms of ergotism like convulsions or gangrene. Over 3 years, he gradually increased the doses while teaching his victims to interpret the resulting visions as divine communication. In 1857, he introduced opium into the evening meal, disguising it as a medicinal tea for spiritual purification. The combination of ergot-induced visions and opium-induced calm created a psychological state where his victims felt simultaneous ecstasy and detachment from their physical bodies. They described feeling as if they were already halfway to heaven, exactly the mental state Wilhelm wanted to cultivate before the final ritual. The fatal dose came on May 3, 1858. During what Wilhelm called the sacrament of elevation. He had mixed hemlock, specifically Conium maculatum, the same poison that killed Socrates, into wine and bread. Hemlock causes progressive paralysis of the nervous system while leaving consciousness intact until the very end. Victims remain aware as their bodies shut down, experiencing it as a gradual separation of soul from flesh. Wilhelm chose this specifically because it matched his theological interpretation of transcendence. He wanted them to feel themselves dying, Dr. Chen said quietly during a presentation to the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. That was part of the ritual. The hemlock allowed them to experience what he framed as the soul leaving the body. They would have felt numbness spreading from their extremities, difficulty breathing, eventually complete paralysis, but they remained conscious almost to the end. He told them this sensation was their spirits being freed from earthly bondage. In reality, they were suffocating from respiratory failure while unable to move or call for help. The forensic analysis also revealed something Father Wilhelm hadn't documented in his journals. Some of the victims had tried to resist at the end. Several skeletons showed hand positions inconsistent with the peaceful repose described in the historical accounts. Two had evidence of vomit in their mouth cavities, suggesting their bodies had tried to reject the poison. One child's skeleton showed signs of having attempted to crawl away. Drag marks in the limestone dust had been photographed by the 1858 military investigators, but their significance had not been understood at the time. Not all of them went peacefully, Dr. Chen concluded. Some fought their bodies shut down, tried to expel the poison, attempted to escape, but by that point they were in a sealed cave with 15 monks standing over them, chanting prayers. They were paralyzed by hemlock and probably still feeling the effects of opium and ergot. Even if their minds realized something was wrong, their bodies couldn't respond. It was a perfect trap. Beudit, the sophistication of Wilhelm's poisoning protocol raised disturbing questions about whether he had tested it previously. Chemical analysis of soil samples from around the monastery grounds revealed traces of the same compounds in areas that had never been documented as grave sites. Dr. Chen's team brought in cadaver dogs, which indicated possible human remains in at least 3 other locations on the property. Excavation revealed bones from an estimated 12 additional individuals, buried separately and decades earlier. Carbon dating and forensic analysis suggested these remains dated from 1845-1850. They showed similar toxicology profiles to the 40 victims from 1858, though with less sophisticated dosing. These appeared to be early experiments, perhaps people who had died during Wilhelm's development of his ritual before he perfected the protocol. The monks had buried them quietly and continued their work, learning from each death how to better manipulate the body and mind toward the peaceful mass death they eventually achieved. This means the actual death toll was at least 52 people, possibly more, Dr. Chen reported. Father Wilhelm didn't just wake up one day and decide to poison 40 people. He spent years developing the methodology, testing different substances and dosages, observing effects, refining his approach. Those early victims were guinea pigs in the most literal and horrifying sense. They died so he could perfect his technique for the larger group. The medical establishment responded with fascination and horror. Toxicologists studied Wilhelm's journals as a case study in systematic poisoning. Psychiatrists analyzed the psychological manipulation techniques he employed. Pharmacologists examined how he combined multiple substances to achieve specific mental states. His methods were sophisticated enough to be published in medical journals, with extensive ethical disclaimers about the monstrous context in which this knowledge was obtained. But perhaps the most significant finding was the simplest. Every victim had elevated cortisol levels preserved in their bones, evidence of prolonged extreme stress. Whatever Wilhelm had told them, whatever they claimed to believe, their bodies told the truth. They had been terrified. The drugs had masked conscious fear, but physiologically they had known they were in danger. Their bodies had been screaming warnings that their drugged minds couldn't process. Dr. Chen summarized her findings in the report's conclusion. Science cannot explain what happened at St. Benedict Monastery because what happened was not mysterious or supernatural. It was deliberate, systematic murder using sophisticated pharmacological manipulation. Father Wilhelm wasn't performing a mystical ritual. He was administering a complex poisoning protocol designed to make victims complicit in their own deaths. The only unexplainable element is how human beings could do this to other human beings while believing they were acting in service of God. If you followed this story this far, leave a like. It helps ensure the truth about these 52 souls reaches more people. Chapter 7. The monks vanish. After Magistrate Brennan's discovery in May 1858, the 15 monks of St. Benedict Monastery disappeared so completely that for 150 years their fate remained unknown. They hadn't been arrested. They hadn't been tried. They simply ceased to exist in any official record, as if the earth had swallowed them whole. But recent investigation into European church archives revealed what happened to some of them, and the truth was almost as disturbing as the crimes they committed. Dr. Heinrich Müller, a German historian specializing in Catholic monastic orders, took up the search in 2009. Using Father Wilhelm's journals as a starting point, he traced the monks' Bavarian origins to a small monastery in the Alps that had been suppressed by church authorities in 1839. The monks had belonged to a sect called the Order of Eternal Transcendence, which believed in accelerating souls' passage to heaven through rituals the mainstream church considered heretical. They weren't random criminals, Dr. Müller explained. They were part of a tradition going back to the Middle Ages, mystics who believed physical suffering and death were gifts rather than tragedies. The church had officially banned their practices, but small groups continued in secret. When American opportunities opened up in the 1840s, Cardinal Antonelli apparently saw a chance to test these old theories in a location where the Vatican could maintain deniability. Church records showed that after the St. Benedict scandal, the Vatican quietly relocated most of the monks to remote locations across Europe and Latin America. They were given new names and assigned to isolated monasteries where they could be monitored. The deal was simple: maintain absolute silence about Kentucky and avoid any similar experiments. In exchange, they wouldn't be prosecuted or defrocked. Father Wilhelm's fate was different. According to a sealed Vatican document marked "Resolved," Wilhelm was taken directly to Rome in June 1858, where he was held in a monastery that functioned as a prison for problematic clergy. He died there in 1862 under circumstances described only as sudden illness. Dr. Müller believed Wilhelm was either poisoned, ironic given his own crimes, or allowed to commit suicide, a way for the church to close the case permanently. The Vatican wanted him gone, Dr. Müller said. He knew too much, had written too much, could potentially speak to authorities if someone asked the right questions. The official story is that he died of cholera during an outbreak, but the timing is suspicious. He died 3 weeks after American newspapers started asking questions about what had happened in Kentucky. I believe he was silenced to protect higher-level officials who had authorized the experiment. Uti, 3 other monks were documented to have met similar fates. Brother Matthias, who had led the chanting during the fatal ritual, died in a monastery in Spain in 1863. Brother Joseph, Wilhelm's second-in-command, died in Brazil in 1864. Brother Klaus died in a monastery in Austria in 1865. All were described as dying from illnesses, all within 7 years of the St. Benedict disaster. The pattern suggested systematic elimination of witnesses, but at least 8 monks survived much longer, living quiet lives in remote locations until natural deaths in their 70s and 80s. Parish records showed them as simple monks who gardened, copied manuscripts, and served local communities without incident. They kept their secrets for decades, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of genuine belief that what they had done was righteous. None left written confessions, none broke their silence. One monk, however, left an indirect testimony. Brother Augustine, who had been the youngest member of the St. Benedict community at just 22 when the mass death occurred, ended up at a monastery in rural France. In 1887, now 51 years old, he began painting a series of murals in the monastery chapel. The paintings depicted scenes from the Book of Revelation, angels and demons, the weighing of souls, the final judgment. But hidden among the conventional religious imagery were disturbing elements that local priests either didn't notice or chose to ignore. In one panel, showing souls rising to heaven, exactly 40 figures ascended, while 15 monks looked on from below. In another, an abbot figure offered bread to kneeling figures, while demonic shapes lurked in the shadows. In a third, limestone caves opened beneath a chapel, and inside them lay white-shrouded bodies arranged in a circle. Dr. Marie Dubois, an art historian who studied the murals in 2011, concluded, "Brother Augustine was confessing through his art what he couldn't confess in words. He had been bound by vows of silence, but he needed to acknowledge what had happened. These murals are a testimony painted in symbolic language, a way of saying, 'This happened, we did this, I was there.' I believe guilt consumed him for the rest of his life." Brother Augustine died in 1902. According to the monastery records, his final words were, "I see them, all 40, they are not in paradise." This statement, recorded by the prior who attended his deathbed, was the only direct reference any of the monks ever made to what happened at St. Benedict. Research also revealed what happened to the monks' families in Bavaria. Church officials had visited each family in 1858, 1859, delivering substantial payments and requiring signatures on documents agreeing never to discuss their relatives' activities in America. These payments, enormous sums for poor farming families, bought silence across a generation. Children were told their uncles or cousins had died in America of natural causes. Questions were discouraged. The money ensured compliance. One family, however, preserved letters from their relative, Brother Stephan, one of the middle-ranking monks at St. Benedict. His letters, discovered in an attic in 2010, provided the only first-hand account of life at the monastery from a monk's perspective. Written in German, they showed a man who had initially believed he was part of a holy mission, but gradually became horrified by what was happening. "Father Wilhelm has gone too far," Stephan wrote in April 1858. "What began as spiritual education has become something else. The people are not being elevated. They are being broken. They no longer think for themselves. They repeat whatever Wilhelm tells them." When I questioned the use of the special bread, likely referring to ergot-contaminated communion wafers, he said doubters would not participate in the final glory. "I'm afraid to speak further. I'm afraid of what will happen." Stephan's final letter, dated just days before the mass death, was incomplete. "Tomorrow is the ceremony. Wilhelm says all 40 have agreed to participate, but I have seen the fear in some of their eyes beneath the drug-induced calm. This is not holy. This is not God's work. I want to stop it, but I'm alone. The others believe completely. If I refuse to participate, they will—" The letter ended mid-sentence. Stephan never finished it, and he never sent it. According to Vatican records, Stephan was one of the monks relocated to Spain, where he lived until 1881. He never wrote another letter home. His family assumed he had forgotten them. The truth was that he had been forbidden all outside communication as part of his agreement to avoid prosecution. He lived nearly a quarter-century in silence, carrying the knowledge of what he had witnessed and his own failure to prevent it. The descendants of the 40 victims had mixed reactions to these revelations. Some felt the monks deserved harsher punishment, death or imprisonment, rather than comfortable retirement in European monasteries. Others noted that the monks were themselves victims of a system that taught them to value souls over bodies and obedience over conscience. Dr. Lydia Moreau offered this perspective. The monks who carried out these murders were tools of a larger system. Yes, they bear personal responsibility for their actions, but they had been trained from childhood to believe that suffering served divine purpose, that earthly life mattered less than eternal salvation, and that religious authority justified any action. The real villains are the church officials who knew better, who understood the moral implications, and who authorized these experiments anyway because they wanted to prove a theological point. Those men died in their beds in Rome, honored and respected, while the people they sacrificed were buried in unmarked graves. Chapter 8. The Descendants Speak. By 2012, 4 years after the monastery archives opened, researchers had identified living descendants of 37 of the 40 victims. Using genealogical records, DNA analysis, and oral histories, they reconstructed family trees spanning 7 generations. The descendants, now numbering in the hundreds, came together for the first time at a memorial service held at the site of St. Benedict Monastery in September 2012. The event drew national media attention. Descendants traveled from across the United States, some meeting cousins they hadn't known existed. They walked the monastery grounds, now overgrown and peaceful. They stood in the limestone caves where their ancestors had died. They placed flowers at a newly erected memorial that listed all 52 names recovered from the records, and they shared stories that had been passed down through their families. Marcus Moreau's great-great-great-granddaughter Maya Moreau was 16 when she attended the memorial. She had grown up hearing stories about ancestors who died mysteriously at a monastery, but only recently learned the full truth. "My whole life, I knew my family had been searching for something," she said. "I knew we had relatives who had been enslaved and died young. But I didn't know they had been murdered by people who called themselves holy men. I didn't know the church had covered it up for 150 years. Learning that changed how I see everything." Thomas Patterson was a 78-year-old retired engineer from Detroit. His great-great-grandmother Esther had been one of the 40 victims. "She wrote letters that were never sent," he said, holding copies of her words. "She talked about how tired she was, how worn out her body was. She said she believed the monks because she needed to believe them, because the alternative was having no hope at all. That breaks my heart. She died because hope was the only thing she had left, and these men weaponized it against her." Dr. Jennifer Washington, a psychologist from Atlanta, descended from a man named Samuel who had left behind letters to his wife. She spoke about the intergenerational trauma that events like St. Benedict created. "My family didn't know exactly what happened, but the trauma was passed down anyway," she explained. "We had stories about relatives who disappeared, about the dangers of trusting religious authority, about secrets that white institutions kept. That psychological inheritance shaped how we move through the world. Now we finally know why." The memorial service included a reading of all 52 names, followed by testimony from descendants who wanted to speak. One by one, they came to the microphone and shared what they knew, what they had learned, and what they wanted the world to remember. A woman named Clara Henderson described how her family had been told that her great-great-grandfather died of fever at a monastery where he was learning to read. They made it sound almost peaceful, almost positive, like he was being educated and just got sick. That lie allowed the people responsible to avoid accountability. It allowed the church to maintain its reputation, but it denied us the truth about how he really died and who killed him. That theft of truth is its own kind of violence. Robert Thatcher, whose ancestor Ruth had written letters describing the strange bread and her confusion about angels and visions, spoke about the drug-induced manipulation. They didn't just kill her body, they killed her mind first. They convinced her that death was salvation while they were slowly poisoning her. She wrote about seeing angels, about feeling disconnected from her body. Those were symptoms of ergot poisoning, but she thought they were proof of God's grace. They stole her ability to understand what was being done to her. That's not mercy killing, that's psychological torture followed by murder.